The storm battered the military base as if it wanted to rip the roofs from the ground, the wind howling through the rusted structures and the lights flickering like an omen. In that biting cold, she received an order that seemed banal, to guard the perimeter until dawn. But what the general didn't say, and perhaps couldn't even say, was that the darkness that night hid more than shadows. Every footstep on the icy gravel echoed like a warning. Every ray of light lost in the fog seemed to sketch human figures that disappeared in an instant. The radio crackled with strange interference, as if someone were whispering behind the static. And just when she thought she was alone, the steady sound of wet boots began to approach, slow, calculated, coming from exactly the direction she least expected. Her heart raced as the figure appeared out of nowhere, emerging from the darkness with the posture of someone who needed no announcement. It was the general, the same one who, hours earlier, had given her the order to remain there. But his face lacked its usual military coldness. There was something different, almost somber, in the gleam in his eyes. He stopped a few feet away, letting the silence hang heavy between them like a sentence. A clap of thunder lit the sky for a second, revealing not only his expression, but also the fresh mark of blood on his right glove. Before she could react, he said her name in a low, heavy tone, like someone harboring a secret that could change everything. And suddenly she understood that the night was dangerous, not because of what might come from outside, but because of what was already there, right in front of her. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe, and come listen to the next one, which is already on the screen. Night lay like a heavy blanket over the base, and each gust of wind seemed to tear away invisible shreds of the courage of those on guard duty. The smell of damp metal and diesel fuel permeated the air, mingled with the cold that burned her exposed skin. She adjusted her beanie, feeling the rough fabric against her forehead, as she adjusted her weapon to her shoulder and observed the darkness beyond the fences. There were no stars, only absolute darkness, punctuated from time to time by lightning that shook the ground. In the command room, the general had been clear, almost harsh, when he gave the order. You keep watch. No one enters, no one leaves. He didn't explain why, nor did he allow for questions. He simply stared at her for a moment that seemed longer than it should have, as if gauging her resolve before leaving her alone. Now, isolated at the farthest point of the base, there was only the sound of her own breathing, the unsettling rustle of a loose tarp against metal, and the dry snap of branches blown down by the wind in the distance. But there was something else, an uneasy feeling that this outpost hadn't been empty before she arrived. The silence wasn't static. It was alive, pulsating, as if someone had shaped it deliberately. A shiver ran down her spine as a fleeting figure passed behind a parked truck, disappearing before she could focus her eyes. She pressed the radio, trying to call the tower, but heard only hissing sounds that resembled muffled whispers. It was as if the night itself were trying to prevent any call for help from reaching anywhere. She took a deep breath, trying to dispel her paranoia, and took 2 slow steps toward the truck, feeling the gravel give way beneath her boots. The wind suddenly stopped, as if the world had held its breath, and for an instant she realized that, amidst that impossible silence, she was about to discover something that would completely change her understanding of who truly commanded this base. The cold seemed to gain weight with each step, seeping through the fabric of her uniform like a silent invader. As she approached the truck, she noticed that its bodywork reflected an uneven sheen, as if it had been touched by damp hands moments before. She touched it with her fingertips and felt the cold metal, almost sharp but also wet. It wasn't rain. It was too dry under the makeshift awning covering part of the vehicle. The humidity had another source. Before she could analyze further, a metallic crack echoed behind her, coming from the east gate. She turned quickly, her heart racing, and raised her weapon with the same instinctive precision years of training had given her. Nothing. Just the elongated shadow of the watchtowers, distorted by the lightning that streaked the sky. She pressed her lips together, trying to control her breathing, but she could feel the blood pounding in her ears, drowning out any outside sound. The radio crackled again, this time with a louder hiss, almost an electronic growl. Then, amid the interference, a male voice whispered her name. It wasn't a formal call, lacking the dry, objective tone of military codes. It was slower, drawn out, as if someone was watching her closely and wanted her to know it. She swallowed hard and took 2 steps back, keeping her eyes on the perimeter, until she felt the weight of her own shadow cast by the beam of light coming from one of the towers. For an instant, the shadow seemed to move independently of her, taller, wider, as if a presence were fitting the contours of her body. Thunder boomed on the horizon, and in that second of intense light, she swore she saw, at the gate, the silhouette of a man standing motionless, watching. His posture was unmistakable, shoulders straight, feet firm, hands behind his back. The general. But he shouldn't be there. She blinked rapidly, certain the flash of thunder might have played tricks on her eyes. When she looked up again, the silhouette at the gate had vanished, swallowed by the darkness, as if it had never been there. But the feeling of being watched didn't dissipate. On the contrary, it grew denser, like an invisible weight pressing down on the back of her neck. She adjusted her posture, listening more closely. Amid the silence and the distant rustle of loose tarps, a distinct sound repeated. The rhythmic beat of footsteps, approaching and stopping at calculated intervals, as if the owner of those feet wanted to measure every second of their approach. She spun on her heel, scanning the area with the scope of her gun, until the beam of her flashlight found the ground. There were fresh footprints in the damp earth, but not from military boots. They were wider, deeper, as if someone were carrying weight or deliberately trying to leave a trail. She followed the path with her eyes, and realized it ended behind a container. Her stomach tightened. She approached, her hand firmly on the trigger, and took a deep breath before turning to the side. Nothing. Just stacked boxes, the strong smell of grease, and a soaked piece of cloth dripping with a dark liquid, too thick to be water. She backed away, but something about the color and metallic smell made her heart race even faster. The wind suddenly picked up, as if the night itself wanted to erase any trace of what she had just seen. A new interference sounded on the radio, but this time it wasn't just the sound. It was a command, short and cold. "Return to the tower." The voice, deep and authoritative, was unmistakable. The general. But she knew he wasn't in the command room, because she had just seen him there at the gate. She hesitated before answering the radio call, her hand still trembling from what she thought she had seen. The wind cut her face like icy blades, but that wasn't what made her shiver. It was the thought that 2 versions of the same man were, somehow, in that base. One, in command. The other, hidden in the darkness, moving unannounced. She pressed the transmitter button, but her voice wouldn't come out, as if something had blocked the sound in her throat. The silence that followed was more ominous than any answer. She decided not to return to the tower, not yet. She walked down the narrow corridor formed by shipping containers, each step echoing with an almost ceremonial weight. Distant lightning cast distorted shadows, creating human figures that faded when she blinked. As she turned a corner, the dim light of a hanging lamp briefly illuminated the ground, revealing something that made her freeze, a general's insignia lying in the mud, a dark stain that the wind and rain had failed to erase. It shouldn't be there. The badge was issued only during ceremonies, kept strictly guarded and never worn on patrol uniforms. She bent down to pick it up, feeling the cold metal in her palm. Just then, she heard firm footsteps behind her. She turned quickly and saw the unmistakable outline of the general standing a few meters away, his boots partially obscured by the low-lying fog. He said nothing. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable, before taking a step forward and disappearing, as if the darkness itself had swallowed him. The sound of her own heartbeat seemed to echo in her ears, momentarily drowning out the roar of the storm. Every fiber of her being wanted to run, but the military logic that had shaped her instincts told her to stay and face it. She let the badge slip into her pocket, closing her hand over it as if to shield that hunk of metal from something she didn't yet understand. Suddenly, a stronger gust of wind blew out the hanging lamp, plunging the corridor of containers into thick darkness. When the light returned, her eyes found his figure closer than before, as if there were no space or time between his disappearance and his reappearance. The general stood there, wet from head to toe, his heavy uniform clinging to his body, and his eyes. They weren't the same. There was a damp, almost feverish glow, as if someone carrying a secret that consumes them from within. "Sir?" Her voice sounded hesitant, a mixture of formality and warning. "I need to know what's going on." He didn't answer right away. He just watched her, tilting his head slightly to the side like a curious predator. He took 2 slow steps, each one striking the gravel with a dry, precise sound. When he stopped, he was close enough for her to smell his hot breath mixed with the metallic scent of blood and iron. "Do you follow orders, soldier?" The question came out low, almost scratchy, as if it had crossed a desert of silence before reaching her. "Yes, sir," he replied firmly, although every muscle was ready to react to the slightest suspicious movement. The general took a deep breath, the hot steam dissolving into the frigid air between them. "So tell me—" He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Why aren't you in the tower as I ordered?" Her heart leaped, but she didn't let herself back down. "Because you were here. I saw it." The words came out quickly, sharply, before her courage could waver. He smiled. Not a smile of relief or kindness, but something crooked, almost imperceptible, that felt more like the satisfaction of someone controlling the pieces of an invisible game. "See what, exactly?" His tone was slow now, heavy, as if he wanted to savor every syllable. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her gaze steady on his. "I saw you at the east gate. I saw the footprints. I saw this." She pulled her badge from her pocket and held it up, letting its metallic glint capture what little light there was. The smile faded, his jaw clenched, and for a moment there was absolute silence, as if even the storm had stepped back to watch. He took another step, so close that his shoulder brushed hers as he passed, and as he passed her, he said softly, almost in her ear, "If you saw that, then you saw too much." The chill that ran down her spine didn't come from the wind. And as he slowly walked away down the hallway, the feeling that his every move was calculated to leave her uncertain about what was real and what was a threat grew even more suffocating. She controlled the urge to blindly chase after him and chose the path that would make any soldier survive. She followed the evidence. The corridor of containers led to the medical bay, a low concrete building where the wind buffeted like the sea pushing against a ship's hull. The door was locked from the inside, the visor blasted with rain. She knocked twice, the code announced itself. Silence. On the third knock she heard a muffled sound, not of footsteps but of something scraping against the floor. She forced the doorknob, the lock giving way with an obscene click to an area supposedly under protocol. The smell hit her first: antiseptic, iron, adrenaline, and blood. In the corner, the infirmary sergeant had his hands bound with makeshift tape, his mouth half covered by soaked gauze. She cut the cloth with the blade of her pocket knife, and he gasped as if returning to the surface. "He was here," she managed to say, her voice breaking. "He ordered morphine, turned off the cameras, told me to forget what I saw. He was injured, right arm. He said no one leaves the base until dawn." She glanced at the monitor panel. The screens didn't show static, as would be expected in a blackout, but a flawless loop of a minute ago, as if time had been frozen by someone who knew exactly which buttons to press. In the bottom corner, a technical log indicated the authorship of the change with a code only high-ranking officers possessed. The general's. The humiliation came like a delayed heat, burning inside. Not from the risk, she knew it, but from the memory of a closeness she'd never dared name. His hand gripping her wrist in practice, stopping a mistake before it could happen, his quick glance that said, "Be careful," and something else no regulation covered. She'd turned that memory into discipline to not cross the line, and now she discovered he treaded lines as if they were designed to break. A silent alarm flashed on the sector panel. "East perimeter. Power in saving mode. Fences depressurized in 15 minutes. It wasn't a glitch. It was a program. She opened the maintenance box and found the circuit breaker locked by a unique seal. Red, marked with the emergency code reserved for command. Beneath it, an invisibly banal envelope shielded from the wind. Inside, her name at the top of an evaluation form, a recent stamp, a handwritten note that stung more than the cold. Loyalty test under pressure, subject to recalibration. There was also a printed photo of her in the guardhouse, taken that same night, from an angle only someone behind the camera could have seen. The general hadn't put her on guard. He'd put her to the test. She took a deep breath, pushed her stomach down, and regained control. The sergeant tried to stand. She propped him up in a chair. "Do you have access to the field phone?" He pointed to a grey briefcase covered in ancient dust. He plugged the cord directly into the hard line, the kind that ignores blackouts and looping. As she turned the crank instead of the dry dialing, a voice flooded the receiver with the intimacy of a repeated secret, the general himself saying her name, slowly as if summoning her. It wasn't a transmission. It was a recording planted on the line, a lure to make her drop the cord and believe nothing would get through the night. She hung up without a tremor. The storm struck the roof with a thunderclap that vibrated the metal trays. In the reflection of a tray, she saw herself pale, the badge in her pocket weighing like a sentence. She unlocked the circuit breaker's seal with a sharp blow. As the perimeter power began to return, the panel lit up another truth. Hangar 3. Access at 02:17H. Authorized by code command. The current time read 02.21. He was 4 minutes ahead, enough to seal whatever he was setting up. Before leaving, she left the sergeant with water, a well-made tourniquet, and the handheld radio set to the internal frequency she'd managed to reactivate via the hard line. As she walked through the door, the wind brought her the sound she already knew by heart, boots on gravel. But now there was another detail, a drag of metallic weight, like something being carried against its will. She followed the shiny trail the rain couldn't erase, a dark line dripping from the concrete slabs until it disappeared into the asphalt leading to the hangars. The night seemed to breathe between one gust and the next, and in the midst of that breathing, the memory of an almost human touch at the firing point became a cut. Without asking her fear for permission, she pushed forward, quickened her pace, and clung to the one rule the general had never been able to control in her. When protocol fails, consciousness takes over. And it was with that consciousness at her fingertips, along with her weapon and key fob, that she pushed open the side door of Hangar 3 and faced all at once the part of the night she didn't want to be seen. The smell of fuel filled the air as the door to Hangar 3 gave way with a metallic groan. Inside, the lighting was poor, a flickering sequence of fluorescent bulbs that flickered as if struggling for life. With each flash, fragments of the scene emerged. The silver fuselage of a military transport plane, crates of supplies stacked to the ceiling, and, farther back, the unmistakable shadow of a man crouched over something. Or someone. She advanced silently, the sound of her own boots muffled by the constant hum of the lights. A dull crack echoed to her left, and turning her head, she noticed the floor was marred with deep scratches, as if a heavy object had been dragged inside minutes earlier. She moved closer, adjusting her aim, until the light revealed the general's right arm, his uniform ripped at the bicep, stained with fresh blood. He didn't turn around immediately. He seemed busy, checking something inside a reinforced box with locks that required double codes. When she finally looked up, there was a strange calm in her eyes, a stark contrast to the storm outside. "I knew you wouldn't follow the order," he said, as if the statement were more of an observation than an accusation. She didn't respond. She just kept her gun pointed, her fingers steady, though inside a war raged between duty and memories. "You've always had this force and this quality," he continued, rising slowly, as if unafraid of being shot. "That's why you were chosen." His proximity had an almost physical weight, but there was something more disturbing. Behind the general, half hidden by a tarp, the outline of a human body, motionless. A military boot poked out from under the cover, and from its size it didn't seem to be his. A chill ran down his spine as a flash of light revealed that the boot was covered in mud, identical to the footprints he'd found on the perimeter. "Who's there?" Her voice was firm, but her gaze remained fixed on his expression, waiting for any micro-reaction that would reveal the truth. He didn't look back. He just gave her a half-smile, that same one, crooked and controlled. "Sometimes, soldier, the best way to protect is to make it look like you're attacking." The words hung in the air, and before she could press on, a dull thud of metal hitting the ground echoed to her right. She spun around quickly, but saw nothing. When she turned back to the general, he was already a step away from the hangar's side exit. Instinct screamed at her not to let him leave, but something in that forced calm, in that gaze that hid more than it revealed, told her the night still held moves that couldn't be stopped without first understanding the board. The wind that blew through the open door extinguished nearly all the lamps, leaving only a dim light swaying in the center of the ceiling. In the brief moment the light stabilized, she approached the tarp and with a quick gesture pulled it away. What she saw made her stomach churn. It wasn't a lifeless body, but a soldier from the base itself, unconscious, his hands bound, and a makeshift bandage on his shoulder. There were no signs of a struggle, only the ragged breathing of someone who had been sedated. Beside it was an envelope sealed with the same red seal she'd found on the circuit breaker. Her name was handwritten on the outside. Before he could open it, a violent gust slammed the door against the wall, and the general's voice echoed from outside. "Decide quickly, soldier. Either you follow me, or you open the envelope." The choice burned in her mind, because each option seemed to lead to a place from which there would be no return. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The sound of the storm was swallowed by an almost solid silence, as if the world awaited the decision. She looked at the envelope in her hand, feeling the symbolic weight of the paper more than its actual weight. Outside, the general's footsteps receded, as if each thud against the ground were a countdown. The cold wind entered the hangar, raising goosebumps on her skin and carrying the distant smell of burning fuel. It was as if the entire night were breathing on her, pushing her back and forth simultaneously. She took a deep breath, put the envelope in her pocket without opening it, and moved forward, deciding to follow the general. She stepped out into the darkness, the rain pelting her face like fine needles, and found herself back in the wide courtyard, separating the hangars from the perimeter. The general walked ahead, unhurried, his hands clasped behind his back, oblivious to the downpour. She closed the distance, her eyes fixed on his silhouette, but he didn't turn. Instead, he entered a side passage that led to a rarely used area, a set of storage rooms housing decommissioned equipment and decommissioned vehicles. The gate was only ajar, and as she pushed it open, she was greeted by a sharp creak and the click of a lone lamp coming on above them. The place smelled of old metal and oil, and the floor was covered in fresh tire tracks and muddy footprints. In the corner, a makeshift table was scattered with maps, aerial photos of the base and surveillance records she'd never seen before. Among them was an image taken that night, showing her on the perimeter, observed from afar, and in the background, a figure resembling the general. He took the photo and placed it in front of her like offering a puzzle piece. "Do you still think there's only one of me here?" he asked, his voice low, almost intimate. Her heart skipped a beat, but she didn't back away. "So who's the other one?" He smiled humorlessly. "It's not a question of who, soldier. It's a question of what and why." Before she could insist, a metallic clang echoed outside, followed by a muffled scream. She turned toward the sound, but the general didn't move. "Go ahead if you can, but be careful. Some truths cannot be taken back once you've seen them." She ran for the exit, crossing the muddy yard to one of the smaller warehouses. The door was half open, creaking in the wind, and inside, on the floor, she found the same soldier who had been unconscious in the hangar, now awake, but his eyes wide with terror. He was mumbling incoherently, repeating only one phrase. "It wasn't him. It wasn't him." A flash of lightning illuminated the interior for a second, and it was enough for her to notice, in the reflection of a metal plate, that behind her was a silhouette identical to the general's, standing still, watching. The chill that ran down her spine came not from the storm, but from the realization that she was in fact between two generals, and perhaps neither of them was truly who they claimed to be. Turning, the figure took a step forward, and before she could react, said in a tone that was a mixture of order and threat, "From now on, soldier, you are no longer just a witness." The echo of that sentence still vibrated in the air when the warehouse door closed behind her with a sharp thud, as if the storm itself had decided to seal the fate unfolding within. The figure before her, identical to the general in every feature, from the precise cut of his hair to the calculated weight of his gaze, took another step, and the ground seemed to close the distance between them. The unconscious soldier in the hangar, now lucid, retreated until his back was pressed against the wall, his entire body trembling as if facing something his mind refused to process. She raised her gun, but the fake general didn't react. He just maintained that cold, almost analytical gaze, like someone studying a rare artifact before deciding whether it's worth destroying. "Who are you?" Her question was firm, but there was a new weight to the words, a mixture of anger and fear she tried to suppress. He didn't answer immediately. He walked slowly to the makeshift table in the corner, where a high-frequency radio emitted a deep, almost hypnotic hum. He placed his hand on the equipment and turned it off with a slow turn of the knob, as if severing the only remaining thread connecting this place to the rest of the base. "I'm what's left when orders stop mattering," he said finally, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Outside, a close clap of thunder vibrated the metal structures, and for an instant, the flash of light revealed, through the crack in the door, the silhouette of the other general, standing in the rain, watching. Two men, the same face, the same posture, separated only by a thin wall and the uncertainty that threatened to tear the ground beneath their feet. The soldier in the corner began to mutter, his voice breaking, "He's not human. He's not human." The words were lost in a sob, but they were enough to make her blood run cold. The fake general approached, his steps precise, and stopped just inches from her. The smell of wet leather and iron was almost suffocating. "The real one?" He tilted his head to the side, his gaze boring into hers. Isn't always the easiest to follow. Before she could react, a metallic crash on the roof made them both look up. The fake general seized the moment to retreat and disappear through the back door of the warehouse, so fast he seemed to have dissolved into thin air. She ran to the main exit, but what she found was even more unsettling. The original general, or at least the one she believed to be the original, was there, alone, his uniform soaked and his breathing ragged. "You're bleeding," she said, staring at the wound on her arm. He simply ran his hand over the stain as if it were an irrelevant detail and replied, "That doesn't matter now. What matters is that you understand, or will understand." A flash of light illuminated the courtyard, and behind it, in the shadow cast on the ground, was another human figure that wasn't hers. Something, or someone, stood nearby, invisible in the direct light. Her stomach tightened. She wasn't just between two generals. She was between two truths that contradicted each other, and at the same time seemed equally dangerous. The rain had turned into thin, relentless sheets, slicing the air and making every breath heavier. The general, or the man she still insisted was the original, stood still, watching her as if waiting for her to make the first move. Behind him, the extra shadow moved imperceptibly, always a millimeter out of step with the light. She tightened her grip on the gun, but hesitated. Firing without certainty would mean choosing sides blindly. "You don't have to understand everything now," he said, with that calm that sounded more like a trap than a comfort. "You just have to do what you've always done. Trust your feelings." The problem was, what she felt at that moment wasn't confidence. It was a suffocating mix of fear, anger, and a strange nostalgia for something that never quite happened, as if her whole life had been a preparation for that night. The sound of something heavy dragging echoed down the corridor to her left. She looked away only for a second, but it was enough for the general to move closer, closing the distance between them until she could feel his warmth mingling with the biting cold. "Don't look where they want you to look," he murmured, as if speaking directly into her ear. "Look at what you're trying to hide." At the same moment, the gate to the opposite warehouse burst open, and a figure identical to his came running out, wet, panting, with a gaping wound on his forehead. "Don't trust him," he shouted, his voice filled with genuine desperation. The scene froze for a second. Two men, the same face, both wounded, both looking at her as if her decision would decide much more than the fate of that night. The rain intensified, and the thunder that followed drowned out all other sounds but not their expressions. One pleading, the other waiting, almost defiant. She took a step back, trying to gain some space, but felt something solid slam into her back, one of the crates in the courtyard, fallen open, revealing its contents. Surveillance equipment, long-range radios, and more photos of her, taken from different angles, some from inside the military barracks where she slept. The chill that ran through her body didn't come from the water. "Is this a game?" he asked, his voice firm despite the pressure that threatened to break through his defenses. "No," replied one. "Yes," replied the other. The contradiction echoed inside her like a double gunshot. Her hand sweated on the grip of the gun, and her mind raced in circles, trying to find a fixed point. The storm seemed to push them all toward the same center, as if it wanted the clash to happen right then and there. That was when a bright light cut through the darkness, not a bolt of lightning, but the headlights of a vehicle barreling through the courtyard. The driver's silhouette was indistinguishable, but the sound of the engine drowned out everything else. Both generals looked in the same direction, and in that split second of shared distraction, she realized that perhaps this was the only way to turn the tide. But any move now would come at a price, and the karma of that choice would not come gently. It would come like the very storm that raged around. The vehicle's headlights swept the courtyard like an artificial eye, revealing details previously hidden by darkness. The muddy ground with fresh tire tracks, puddles reflecting distorted figures, the hot steam escaping from mouths open with rapid breathing. The engine roared low, drawing closer, but neither general backed away. They remained motionless, like pieces in a game that would only move at the exact moment. She, in the center, felt the crushing weight of being the link that determined the next move. The vehicle screeched to a halt, and the light that had previously illuminated the courtyard swung directly toward her, momentarily blinding her. The sound of a door slamming echoed, followed by quick footsteps in the pooled water. Before she could identify who was arriving, she felt a violent tug on her arm. The general to her right was dragging her behind a container. She reacted instinctively, twisting and wrenching free, her gun now pointed at his chest. Then the other general appeared from the side, moving with military precision, and within seconds the scene had transformed into a closed triangle, she in the center and they on opposite sides, both armed. No gunshots, just the sound of rain and the silence that precedes a dam burst. "He's not who he says he is," said the one on the left, the one with the wound on his forehead, his voice filled with urgency. "And he wants you to believe exactly that," replied the one on the right, the one with the wounded arm, with a coldness that sounded almost convincing. The air between them was like glass about to crack. She took a deep breath, trying to ignore the roar of the still-running engine behind her, and kept her eyes on every detail, the slight tremor in one's hand, the other's impeccable control, the way they both avoided looking directly at the photos scattered on the nearby floor. Suddenly, a metallic crash came from above, something heavy sliding across the shed roof, and, like a synchronized reflex, they both looked away for a moment. That moment was enough. She moved quickly, ducking and sliding to the side of the vehicle, using the bed as cover. The sound of boots against metal echoed from just behind. One of them was following her. She spun around, ready to fire, but what she saw disarmed her insides. It wasn't either of them. It was the soldier she'd found unconscious, now with a radio in his hand, and the look of someone carrying an unbearable burden. "They're no different," she said in a thin voice. "They're two sides of the same story." Before he could process it, a shot rang out, ricocheting off the vehicle's bodywork. The soldier fell to his knees, unhit but paralyzed by fear. She pulled him back into the car as the silhouettes of the two generals appeared again, closing in. The engine roared as she turned the key left in the ignition. The vehicle surged forward, kicking up mud and water, forcing them to retreat. But there was no time for real escape. They both moved in perfect coordination, one blocking the front, the other the rear. It was at that moment that she understood. It didn't matter who was real or fake. What mattered was that, one way or another, the night wouldn't end without one of them falling, or her. The rain had now become almost solid, lashing the vehicle's bodywork and dripping down the sleeves of her uniform until it chilled her bones. The circle was closed. One general blocked the front, the other held the rear, and each step they took on the gravel seemed to echo within her like a sentence. The soldier beside her was breathing rapidly, as if expecting a bullet at any moment. She knew that if she tried to rush through, she would be nothing more than another easy target. So she let the silence stretch, creating an uncomfortable emptiness, while her eyes assessed every exit, every object that might turn into an advantage. The envelope in her pocket weighed like lead. She didn't know if it was a trap or the key to escape, But curiosity now competed with the need to survive. Without hesitation, she took it out and held it up in front of them both, as if it were a trump card. "Do you want this?" she shouted, her voice rising above the roar of the storm. The reaction was immediate. They both took a step forward, almost simultaneously, and it was in that detail that she found the opening. Feigning a stumble, she tossed the envelope to the side where the wind swept it across the courtyard. As they both instinctively looked away, she grabbed the soldier by the arm and threw herself out of the car, running toward a stack of metal crates. Behind them, a runway flare kit lay open, its flares exposed and ready. She pulled out two, flicked them against the rough surface, and the red flash exploded, painting the rain and shadows with vibrant light. She tossed one flare toward the gate and another into the nearest shed, creating two sources of distraction. The generals split up, each going to investigate a different light, and this gave her precious seconds. Wasting no time, she ran down the narrow corridor between the warehouses, her heart hammering in her ribs. But she knew there was no point in simply running. She had to turn the tide. At the end of the corridor, she spotted a maintenance ladder leading to the warehouse's low roof. She climbed it quickly, pulling the soldier with her, and from there she had a full view of the courtyard. She saw them moving like hunters, each believing they were about to corner her. He took advantage of his height and grabbed a loose piece of metal from the roof, throwing it toward one of the crates near the gate. The metallic clang reverberated, and one of the generals fired at the moving shadow. The dull thud of impact echoed, but there was no scream. Only the heavy silence of someone who realized they had been tricked. The other general, upon hearing the shot, advanced in the wrong direction, exposing himself completely in the open field. She knew she wouldn't get another chance. She jumped from the roof to the inner courtyard, using the sound of the storm to mask her fall. With the soldier protected behind a stack of drums, she pulled the radio from her emergency kit and activated the open frequency, broadcasting a short message to the entire base. Code Shadow. 2 targets. Same command. Perimeter at risk. The transmitter's crackle cut through the air, and she felt adrenaline surge through her veins. Outside, quick footsteps indicated the hunt was still on, but now at least she was no longer alone, and they both knew it. The game had changed, and the night, which until then had been theirs, was beginning to tilt her way. The rain seemed to ease, but it wasn't relief. It was the artificial calm that preceded the final blow. The radio still crackled in her chest, repeating the code shadow message throughout the base, each echo drawing more attention to the courtyard. She kept the soldier under cover, her eyes scanning every shadowy spot. Then, from the east gate, silhouettes of other soldiers appeared, drawn by the call. Their arrival should have been a sign of safety, but deep down she knew, until she proved who the real one was, no one was safe. The two generals emerged almost simultaneously, coming from opposite directions, soaking wet and with the same determined look. One of them raised his voice, trying to take command of the situation, but the other interrupted, repeating the same orders word for word, like a cruel reflex. The newly arrived soldiers exchanged confused glances, unsure of whom to obey. The tension was so thick it seemed to shape the air. It was then that she pulled the envelope from her pocket, the same one she had used as a distraction, intact. With almost rehearsed calm, she broke the seal in front of everyone. Inside only one sheet, a report of a loyalty test, signed with a high command identification code with a list of criteria evaluated, and at the end, a single handwritten comment: "Blind trust is weakness. True loyalty is to the truth, not to orders." The surrounding soldiers began to murmur and the balance of power shifted. She held the sheet high for all to see and pointed to the general on her right. "He injured and kidnapped a man from his own base to test me." Then she turned to the other, "And he tried to manipulate me into destroying the only link that could reveal what was really going on." The murmurs grew into firmer voices, and the circle of soldiers closed in. One of the generals stepped forward, trying to regain control through authority, but before he could finish his sentence, one of the sergeants raised his weapon defensively, not against her, but against him. The silence that followed was broken only by the heavy breathing of the two men. Then, as if accepting the inevitable, the general on the left, the one with the wounded arm, slumped his shoulders and let out a brief, almost contemptuous laugh. "Looks like you passed the test." But the other didn't laugh. He took a step forward and looked her straight in the eye, his eyes steady. "There's no test when the intention is to get your hands dirty." And he did. Then, turning to the soldiers, "Follow protocol." The weight of the decision lifted from her hands and shifted to the collective. Within seconds, 2 pairs of handcuffs snapped shut, one for each man. It was no longer possible to tell who was who, but that no longer mattered. Karma didn't require absolute certainty, only balance. As dawn began to break over the horizon, she remained where she was, feeling the base breathe easier. The soldier beside her murmured a thank you, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the torn envelope in her hand, a silent reminder that in the war between orders and conscience, survival wasn't just a matter of obedience. It was a matter of knowing when to stop following and start choosing. If this story kept you hooked until the end, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and get ready for the next one that's already appearing on your screen right now.